On my 68th birthday, my son handed me an envelope. Not a card, not a small gift wrapped in shiny paper, but a plain white envelope, sealed hastily, as if even the glue had been in a hurry to be done with me. I sat there at the end of the kitchen table, my coffee cooling beside a store-bought cake I hadn't wanted, as he slid it across the wood like a bill he didn't want to discuss. That was the moment I knew I no longer wanted, not in this house, not in this life I had helped build. I'm Eleanor Hayes, 68 years old, and that was the moment I felt myself quietly erased. Subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Thanks. I remember staring at the envelope for a long while, my fingers trembling slightly as I picked it up. There was no weight to and heft of something warm, no folded letter filled with gratitude or love, just a single sheet of paper inside, crisp and cold. I slid it out and saw the name of a residence printed at the top in thick black letters, along with information about tours and room availability. It took me a few seconds to realize what I was holding. I looked up then, my son already retreating to the sink, rinsing his plate as if his hands had somewhere better to be. The house felt quiet, too quiet for a birthday, too quiet for what birthdays used to be. I let the paper fall back into the envelope, smoothing it as though that could soften the blow. My grandson, only 10, peeked around the corner, sensing something he didn't understand, and I managed a small smile for him, but even that felt like a mask I could no longer wear. I didn't ask questions. I didn't raise my voice, or let the tears come just then. I simply sat there, watching the sun stretch through the kitchen window, catching on the dust motes I hadn't noticed before. The same window I had cleaned hundreds of times, the same light that had spilled onto countless family meals, birthday breakfasts, Christmas mornings, and now it felt like a spotlight, exposing the last bit of my dignity it hadn't taken yet. Later that evening, as the house settled into its usual rhythm, the sound of the television from the living room, my grandson's laughter floating down the hallway, I found myself in my small room at the back of the house, a room that had once been the sewing room, then a guest room, then mine. I looked around at my things, the framed photograph of my late husband, the worn armchair where I'd spent hours reading, the dresser that still smelled faintly of cedar. How many times had I told myself that being here was enough, that sharing this roof with my son's family meant I still had a place, a purpose? The paper on my nightstand told me otherwise. I think back to the first night I moved in with them, 7 years earlier, after my husband passed. My son had insisted, "You shouldn't be alone, Mum," he'd said, his voice thick with what sounded like care at the time. I'd believed him. I'd packed my life into boxers, sold the house where I'd raised him, and come here to help, to belong, to matter. But things shift. Slowly at first, like a door that doesn't quite latch. Little moments, little signs. A missed good morning, a door closed just a bit too firmly, invitations that stopped coming. And now, a brochure for a place with pastel walls and scheduled activities. A place, I suppose, where I could be out of the way. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my chair, listening to the creaks of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft patter of rain that began around midnight. I thought about my husband, how he'd known how to make me laugh when the world felt heavy. I thought about my own mother, how she'd always feared being put away, as she called it, and how I'd promised her she'd never be left, and I hadn't. But here I was. Morning came with the scent of toast and coffee drifting down the hallway. The house stirred awake, as if nothing had changed, as if that envelope hadn't been slid across the table like a parting gift. I moved, slowly, methodically, folding the cardigan I'd draped over the chair, tidying my few things. My son's voice floated from the kitchen, casual light, talking about school drop-offs and the weather. My daughter-in-law's laughter, bright and effortless, and I felt invisible. It wasn't anger I felt, not yet. It was something quieter, a hollowing out, a knowing, the kind of knowing that settles in your bones, that you carry in your chest like a stone. I went about the day as if I hadn't seen that paper, as if I hadn't read those words, but inside, a clock had started ticking. A countdown. The next few days passed in a kind of haze. I found myself noticing things I hadn't paid much mind to before: the way my son avoided my eyes, the way conversations seemed to stop when I entered a room, the way my name was rarely spoken aloud. I became a shadow in my own life, watching as they moved around me, as if I were already gone. One afternoon, I stepped outside and sat on the bench in the small garden I'd tended since I moved in. The roses were in bloom, pale pink and soft as silk. I ran my fingers along a petal, marveling at its quiet perfection. I wondered who would care for them when I was gone. Would anyone notice if they withered? The garden had been my refuge, my little claim in a world that no longer seemed to have space for me. I thought of the hours I'd spent there, pruning, planting, coaxing life from the soil. I thought of the birthdays I'd made special, the meals I'd cooked, the school pickups I'd done without complaint. And yet, it had come to this. That evening, I packed a small bag, not out of spite, not out of haste, but because I knew. I packed the photo of my husband, my favorite cardigan, and a book I hadn't finished. I left the rest. Things, after all, are just things. I sat on the edge of my bed, hands folded in my lap, and waited. I don't know what I expected. A change of heart, a knock at the door, an apology. None came. The house quieted again, and I heard the sound of my grandson's bedtime story, my son's voice soft and even. I wondered if he remembered the stories I'd told him at that age, the nights I'd stayed up with him when he was ill, the songs I'd sung to soothe him. But that's the thing about memory. It fades for some faster than others. And so, I waited. I waited for the next step, the next word, the next moment that would tell me where I belonged. But deep down, I already knew. The envelope had said it all. The rain came again that night, gentle at first, then steady, drumming against the window pane like a heartbeat. And I sat there, listening, feeling the weight of all I had given and all that had been quietly taken. When the sun rose the next morning, casting soft stripes of gold across my room, I sat quietly on the edge of the bed, the small bag still resting by my feet. The house stirred to life beyond my door, the low murmur of voices, the clink of plates, the start of another day that I felt myself drifting further from. I had always believed that love was shown in the things we do, not the things we say. And I suppose that's why the silence that now filled these walls felt heavier than words ever could. I found myself tracing back through the years, like paging through a photo album no one else seemed interested in anymore. I thought of all I had done, all I had given, the countless ways I had folded myself smaller to make room for them. It began, of course, long before this house, long before this moment. It began the day I became a mother. I remember the night my son was born, as if it were yesterday. A storm had rolled through, shaking the windows of the small hospital room where I labored through the night, alone for much of it, as my husband had been caught in traffic on the flooded roads. The nurses kept checking on me, offering reassurances, but I was terrified, exhausted, and aching in every part of my body. When my son finally arrived just before dawn, they laid him in my arms, and I knew with a clarity I had never felt before that I would do anything to keep him safe, to give him everything I could, and I did. There were the sleepless nights, rocking him for hours, pacing the creaky floors of our tiny home. There were the scraped knees I kissed, the fevers I soothed, the monsters I chased from under the bed. When he was small, I stayed up late sewing costumes for school plays, baking cupcakes for class parties, hemming trousers for band concerts. I worked part-time at the library, shelving books and minding the children's corner, so I could be there when he got home from school. When he was a teenager, I saved every penny I could so he could go on field trips, buy his first second-hand car, attend the summer programs he dreamed of. I went without new clothes, without holidays, without complaints. I patched the elbows of my cardigans, made do with sensible shoes, all so he could have more. His father worked hard too, but it was me who kept the household running, who stretched the budget, who made sure the birthdays were celebrated, the Christmases magical, the small moments remembered. After my husband passed, I never hesitated. When my son said I should come live with him, he made it sound like an invitation, like an offer of shelter and warmth. I didn't want to intrude, but he insisted, and I convinced myself that it was right, that helping with his boy, keeping the home steady, was what I was meant to do. And so, I packed up the house we had built our lives in, sorting through decades of memories, giving away most of what we owned. I kept only what would fit in a few BAFTAs. In their home, I became part of the background at first by choice, then by habit, then by necessity. I cooked most nights, because they were busy, and I didn't mind. I cleaned quietly while they were out, because I knew how hard they worked. I watched my grandson when needed, drove him to soccer practice, helped him with his reading when school felt too heavy for him. I was there, always there, in the small, unnoticed ways that keep a family moving. I remembered every birthday, every anniversary, every little milestone. I made the cakes, decorated the dining room with paper streamers and balloons, even when no one else seemed to care. I wrapped presents with care, signed cards with love, and put thought into every gesture. I was the one who noticed when someone's favorite mug broke and quietly replaced it, the one who mended a torn backpack, who kept the pantry stocked, who made sure there were clean towels in the bathroom. But these things accumulate in silence. They do not demand attention, nor do they often receive it. I never asked for thanks. I never expected fanfare. But I think, perhaps, I had hoped for a kind of seeing, knowing that I was here, that I mattered, that my presence wasn't invisible. I thought of the times I stayed up late waiting for them to come home, worrying when the roads were slick with rain, when the news spoke of accidents. I thought of the times I kept my opinions to myself so as not to cause waves, the holidays I spent ensuring everyone else's joy while mine quietly faded into the background, the sacrifices I made, not grand or dramatic, but the kind that etched into your spirit over time. And now, with a single piece of paper, it seemed all of that had been swept aside, as if none of it had counted, as if I were a burden to be moved, managed, placed elsewhere so that life could proceed without inconvenience. I stepped out into the garden again that afternoon, my hands brushing against the lavender, the rosemary, and the mint I had planted along the path. The air was warm, the kind of warmth that seeps into your bones, and I closed my eyes for a moment, letting it wash over me. I thought about the meals I had prepared using these herbs, the teas I had brewed when someone had a cough or a sore throat. Small comforts, small, unnoticed comforts. The garden had always been my sanctuary, a place where I could give without being asked, where the results of my care grew tall and fragrant and uncomplaining. But even there, I felt the shadow of what was coming, the quiet packing away of a life lived in service to others. As I trimmed a rose that had begun to fade, I thought of all the times I had trimmed away parts of myself, convinced it was for the greater good. The invitations I turned down so I could babysit, the friendships I let drift because my family needed me, the dreams I set aside, not grand dreams, just small ones, a class I wanted to take, a trip I longed for, a hobby I thought I'd pursue when the time was right, but the time had never been right. And now, as I stood there with the sun setting low, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, I wondered where all that giving had gone, what it had amounted to. Who had noticed? I turned to go back inside, my steps slow, deliberate. The house glowed in the twilight, familiar and foreign all at once. Inside, I could hear the soft hum of the television, the clatter of dishes being washed, the faint sound of my grandson's laughter. Life went on, as it always does, with or without acknowledgement of the hands that helped shape it. I paused at the door, my fingers resting on the frame, and I thought of my mother again, how she used to say, "Love is work you do without applause." I had believed that, and maybe I still did, but standing there, I also felt the quiet ache of knowing that sometimes we give so much of ourselves that there's nothing left to keep. The house welcomed me in, as it always had, but I felt more like a visitor than ever before. I went to my room, sat in my chair, and listened once more to the rain that began to fall, gentle at first, then steady. I watched it streak down the window pane, blurring the world beyond, and I thought about all I had done for them, and how little of it seemed to remain. And still, I waited. For what? I wasn't sure. But I waited, all the same. It is strange, the things we notice when we begin to disappear, not all at once, but piece by piece, like threads pulled from a well-worn sweater. Small things at first, so small that you tell yourself not to mind, that these are just the ways of busy people, of modern life. But they gather, they collect like dust in the corners of a room no one visits anymore, until one day you realize you are standing alone in that room, wondering how long you have been invisible. After that morning, when the envelope rested on my nightstand like a stone I could not set down, I began to see those 100 quiet hurts with new eyes. They had been there, of course, for years, whispers of distance, of dismissal, of being gently set aside, but I had not wanted to see them clearly before. I had told myself stories, instead, kinder ones, to soften the edges of truth. I thought of the phone calls that used to come, the little check-ins during the day when my son would ring, just to ask if I needed anything from the shop, or how I was feeling, or simply to share a moment of his day. Over time, those calls grew shorter, then less frequent, until they became rare, as if I had moved to another country instead of living under the same roof. When they did come, they often ended abruptly, voices distracted, the promise of calling back left unfulfilled. There were visits too, or rather, the absence of them. When my daughter-in-law's parents visited, the house would fill with laughter and light, with the smell of something special cooking on the stove. The good plates would come out, and wine glasses would clink, and I would stay mostly in the background, helping where I could, watching them glow in the warmth of each other's company. But when I suggested inviting an old friend of mine for tea or asked if my sister might visit for a weekend, there was always a reason to postpone, a reason that felt like no reason at all, if I let myself look too closely. I remembered birthdays that passed without so much as a candle, anniversaries of my husband's passing that I marked alone, sitting on that garden bench in the twilight. The house would hum with its usual rhythm, unaware or unwilling to pause, and I would sit quietly, hands folded in my lap, remembering the man who had loved me well, wondering how love had faded so quietly from these walls. It was in the small gestures that the erosion showed itself most. The way a door might close a little too firmly when I entered a room, the way my suggestions at dinner became unwelcome, the meals I prepared met with polite thanks or quiet indifference, the way decisions were made without where to vacation, what to plant in the yard, how to rearrange the furniture, as if my presence were a placeholder, not a person. There were moments, too, when I felt the weight of being managed rather than loved, the reminders about appointments I had not forgotten, the gentle corrections when I offered to help with something as if I might break it, the way they spoke about me, sometimes just out of earshot, in tones I recognized from my own youth, when we spoke of elderly neighbors with a mix of pity and irritation. I heard it in their voices now, though they tried to mask it, and still, I stayed quiet, because that is what I had always done. Because I did not want to be a burden, because I hoped that by being patient, by being good, I could hold on to the place I thought I had. I thought of the evenings I spent in my small room, listening to the sound of their laughter down the hall, their stories shared over dinner, the television shows they watched together. I would hear the rise and fall of their voices, the clink of cutlery, the opening and closing of cupboards, and I would sit with my book or my knitting, telling myself I preferred the quiet. But the truth was, I missed being part of that noise. I missed being needed, being seen. There were times when my grandson would come to me, seeking comfort after a bad dream, or help with a puzzle that frustrated him. In those moments, I felt whole again, felt the old warmth of connection. But even that began to change. He grew, as children do, and the world beyond these walls called to him, his friends, his games, his own small independence. And I was proud of him, of course I was. But each time he chose something else over me, it felt like another stitch undone. I began to notice, too, how my things seemed to shrink within the house. A book I had left on the coffee table quietly moved to my room. A plant I had tended on the windowsill was replaced by a newer one, chosen by my dog. The little signs of my life there, slowly erased or hidden, as if to make room for something fresher, more fitting, and the words that hurt the most were not shouted or cruel. They were soft, almost kind. Mum, why don't you rest? Let us handle it. You've done enough. You deserve a break. Each one, on the surface, is a gesture of care. But beneath them, a pushing away, a setting aside, a gentle removal from the center of things, until I was on the edges, looking in. The days blurred together. I would wait, tend to my small routines, listen to the life of the house unfold without me, and go to bed again, wondering how I had become so separate. I tried, sometimes, to step back and I offered to cook, to help in the garden, to join in their plans, but more often than not, I was met with polite refusals, with reassurances that they had it handled, and so, I let myself fade, not because I wanted to, but because I did not know how to fight for a place that no longer seemed to exist. I spent long hours in the garden during those weeks. The air smelled of summer, of warm earth and growing things. I trimmed the roses, gathered herbs, and watched the bees at their work, and I thought about all the ways love can look like duty, all the ways duty can wear you down, all the ways silence can be mistaken for peace. The envelope still sat on my nightstand, unopened since that first day. I didn't need to read it again. I knew what it said, what it meant. It was the final quiet hurt, the one that named what I had tried so hard not to see. And still, I waited. For the next small hurt, the next gentle push away, the next piece of myself I would have to let go of. But the waiting began to feel different, heavier. as though the weight of all those quiet hurts had finally settled fully upon me. It is one thing to feel yourself being slowly edged out of a life, to sense the gentle closing of doors that once stood open. It is another thing entirely when the door is shut, quietly but firmly, and you are left standing on the other side, no longer guessing at what is coming but knowing, with a finality that leaves no room for hope. The envelope on my nightstand had been the first crack in the foundation, but what came next broke it wide open. I had been trying, in my own quiet way, to find the shape of my place in the house after that day. I still rose early, made tea for myself, tended to the garden, and kept to my room when I felt my presence might be an inconvenience. I tried to stay useful, invisible when needed, visible only in ways that did not disturb. I told myself that surely, if I remained gentle and good, they would see me again. Weeks passed like this. Summer deepened, bringing with it long, hot afternoons and the hum of cicadas in the trees. I spent hours in the garden, pruning and weeding, my hat shielding my face from the sun. The roses thrived under my care, the herbs fragrant and full. The garden was the one place that still felt mine. It was a Thursday when the final line was crossed. I remember it with a clarity that both comforts and haunts me. The house was unusually quiet that afternoon. My son was working from home, as he often did, his voice occasionally floating down the hallway during meetings. My daughter-in-law had taken my grandson to a friend's house. I was alone in the kitchen, wiping down the counters, the rhythmic motion of the cloth giving me something to focus on. I heard them before I saw them, not raised in anger, but low, serious, the kind of tone people use when discussing something they know will hurt. I moved softly toward the sound, drawn despite myself. I stopped just outside the door of my son's study, the door ajar. I had no intention of eavesdropping, not truly, but the words found me anyway. I've spoken with the solicitor. It's all sorted now. We'll have the house in our names soon. Enough. She doesn't need to worry about these things at her age. A pause. I know, but it's for the best. For everyone. We can't keep living like this, like we're waiting for the next thing to go wrong. She's had her time. We need to think about our future now. There was a softness in his voice that broke me more than if he had shouted. A tenderness that said he believed this was kindness. That removing me, erasing my name from what was left of my life, was an act of mercy. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my heart pounding so loudly I thought surely they must hear it. The house in our name, my home, my small piece of security, the place I had come to in good faith, to be with family, to help, to belong, taken, just like that, signed away, arranged behind closed doors while I tended the garden and tried to stay useful. I stepped back quietly, retreating to my room, my hands trembling so badly I had to sit before my legs gave out. I stared at the walls, at the familiar things that surrounded me, the photograph of my husband, the worn chair, the small vase of fresh herbs I kept on the windowsill. I thought of the house we had sold after he died, how hard it had been to let it go, how I had trusted that this would be a new beginning, a place where I would be safe, where I would matter. That betrayal was not loud. It came dressed in practicality, wrapped in the language of reason. But it cut all the same. I did not confront them. That was never my way. Instead, I sat there in the gathering dusk, listening as the house settled into its evening rhythm. I heard my grandson return, heard the clatter of dishes at dinner, the low murmur of television, and I realized that the choice had been made, that I was no longer part of the we in this house. It was an obligation to be managed, a loose end, to be tied up. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I thought of the years I had spent pouring myself into this family, the sacrifices, the silences I had kept, the small kindnesses that had gone unnoticed. I thought of my mother's voice, so long gone, reminding me that love is shown in actions, and I wondered what kind of love this was. The next morning, I rose, as usual. I made my tea, tended to the garden, moved through the day as if nothing had changed, but inside, something quiet but irreversible. A knowing had settled into me, as certain as the sun rising. I understood, at last, that my place here had been an illusion I had clung to out of hope, out of habit, out of love. They had crossed the line I could not cross. And now, I had to decide what came next. I began, slowly, to gather my things. Not in haste, not in anger, but with a kind of clarity I had not felt in years. I took down the photographs that meant something to me, folded my clothes carefully, set aside the few keepsakes I could not bear to leave behind. The rest, I left where it was. Things, after all, are just things. I moved differently through the house after that, not out of spite or bitterness, but because I knew, deep in my bones, that I could no longer stay where I was not wanted. I had given everything I had to give. Now, it was time to keep what little remained of myself. I waited for the right moment. I did not want a scene, did not want to burden my grandson with questions he was too young to understand. I watched, I listened, I planned, and all the while, the house went on as if nothing had changed, as if I were not packing my memories away behind closed doors. I did not tell them I knew. I did not ask for explanations or apologies. There was nothing left to say that would change what had been done. And so, I waited, quietly, patiently, for the right time to go, for the chance to slip away with what dignity I could salvage. And as I waited, I thought of all that had brought me to this place, all the quiet hurts, all the sacrifices, all the moments of love and loss. I thought of what it meant to be let go, and I resolved, at last, to let go in return. Silence can be a refuge. It can be the space where grief takes shape, where anger cools into something sharper, quieter, more enduring. In the days that followed, I moved through the house like a ghost of myself, the knowledge of what they had done settling over me like a second skin. There was no fight left in me. I did not rage, did not accuse, did not plead. I simply went, silent. It was a choice, though it felt at times like surrender. I stopped offering to help with dinner, stopped asking if they needed anything from the shops. I stopped suggesting we spend time together, stopped trying to wedge myself into a space that had already been cleared of me. My voice, once woven into the daily rhythm of this house, fell away. And I don't think they even noticed at first. Mornings became my own, quiet and measured. I would rise early, before the rest of the house stirred, and sit with my tea at the kitchen table, watching the light creep across the floorboards. The garden called to me still, and I would lose myself in tending to it, pulling weeds, deadheading roses, brushing the soil from my palms. There was peace in that, a kind of anchoring. Out there among the plants, I could forget for a while the weight of what I now knew. Inside, the walls seemed to hum with conversations I was no longer part of. I heard them making plans, heard the laughter that no longer reached my room, and heard my grandson's voice growing more distant as his world expanded beyond me. And I stayed silent, not out of spite, but because I had nothing left to give that would be heard. I began saving, quietly, in the way that women like me have always saved. Coins slipped from my small allowance into an old tin at the back of my drawer, a few bills here and there, folded and hidden among my sewing things. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small seed of independence, fragile and slow, growing. When errands took me into town, I would stop by the library, a place that had always felt safe to me. I began to borrow books on subjects I never thought I'd need to understand: legal rights, housing options for seniors, guides to managing on a modest income. I read them in the evenings, the words both comforting and terrifying. I made notes, drew up quiet plans. I also spoke, just once, with a solicitor in town, a kind man, soft-spoken, who listened as I described my situation in careful, measured terms. I did not name names, did not speak ill of my son. I simply asked questions, gathered information, learned what rights, if any, I still had. When I left his office, my heart felt heavy, but my mind became clearer. In my silence, I discovered truths I had long avoided. I saw, with painful clarity, how far I had let myself be diminished in the name of peace. How many times I had excused slights, overlooked exclusions, swallowed hurt, all in the hope of keeping harmony. But harmony cannot be built on the erasure of oneself. It is a fragile thing, brittle and hollow. The house carried on around me, my son and his wife, busy with work and their own worries, my grandson, full of energy and wonder, drifting further into his own world of friends and school and discovery. The space I occupied grew smaller by the day, though the walls remained the same. I listened, sometimes, to their conversations, not out of malice, but because I could not help it. I heard them discussing the logistics of what would come next, the paperwork, the meetings, the practicalities of moving me on. They spoke of it in the same tone one might use when planning a home repair, a necessary task, devoid of emotion. I think they thought they were being kind, that they were sparing me distress by keeping me out of it, but the exclusion itself was its own cruelty. And so, I went silent. I did not protest, did not ask questions, did not challenge their decisions. I turned inward, tending to the small life I still controlled: the garden, my room, my savings, my thoughts. The days passed in a kind of muted rhythm, each one carrying me closer to the moment when I would leave. In that silence, I also began to grieve, not just for the home I was losing, but for the family I thought I had, for the years of love and labor that seemed, now, to have counted for so little, for the woman I had been, the mother, the wife, the caretaker, who had given so much of herself that there was hardly anything left. Grief is a strange companion. It sits with you in the quiet moments, wraps itself around you in the night, whispers truths you wish you could unhear. But it also clears the way for what must come next. It strips away illusion, leaves only what is real. I moved differently through the house after that, my steps quieter, my presence smaller. I became an observer, no longer trying to belong, and in that withdrawal, I began to see them as they were, not as the family I longed for, but as people, flawed and human, doing what they thought was best. Even as it broke my heart, there was no dramatic moment, no confrontation, just the slow, steady retreat of my spirit from a place that no longer welcomed it. I folded my silence around me like a cloak and waited. The garden became my sanctuary in those weeks. I would sit for hours, watching the bees, listening to the wind in the trees, feeling the sun warm my face. Out there, I felt closer to my husband than I ever did inside those walls. I would speak to him, in my mind, telling him of my plans, my fears, my small triumphs. I imagined his voice, steady and kind, urging me on. I think, in some way, my silence was my strength. It gave me the space to think clearly, to plan, to remember who I was beneath the layers of sacrifice and sorrow. It was not the silence of defeat, though it felt heavy at times. It was the silence of gathering, of preparing, of reclaiming what little power remained to me. And so I waited, in that quiet space I had carved out for myself. I waited for the moment when I would take the next step, the moment when I would choose myself, at last, over the life that had let me go. The thing about silence is that it teaches you to listen, not just to others, but to yourself. As the weeks passed, my silence no longer felt like a weight I carried. It became a kind of compass, pointing me gently toward what I had to do. I moved differently after that, not suddenly, not with any great fanfare, but with purpose, with quiet resolve. Each morning, I woke before the sun rose. I would sit by the window, the one that faced the garden, and I would watch the first light spill over the edges of the trees, the soft pink and gold of dawn brushing against the world. I would breathe in that new day and remind myself that I was still here, that I still had choices. And then I would begin. I started by making small changes that only I noticed at first. I cleared out the drawers in my room, letting go of things I no longer needed. I folded what I would keep with care, stacked them neatly, and set them aside. I sorted through my books, my sewing things, the little keepsakes I had gathered over the years. Each item I touched, I asked myself if it would come with me. Most of it would not, and that was all right. Things, I reminded myself, are not what we carry in the end. My savings grew, slowly but steadily. Every bit of change I had tucked away, every small bill I added to the envelope hidden beneath the lining of my suitcase, became a symbol of my quiet determination. It wasn't much. It would not buy me grand comforts or luxuries, but it would be enough to start. And that was all I needed. I began to venture out more, not far, just enough to remind myself of the world beyond those walls. I walked to the shops, to the library, to the park at the edge of town where I could sit and watch the ducks glide across the pond. I would sit on a bench beneath the old willow tree, my hands folded in my lap, and I would feel the breeze on my face, the sun warm on my skin. It reminded me that I was part of something larger, something that had not forgotten me. There was a small charity shop near the high street, and I began stopping in when I had the chance. I would look through the shelves of used dishes, the racks of gently worn clothes, the bins of old linens and curtains. I spoke with the woman who worked there, a kind soul named Margaret, who always greeted me with a smile. Over time, I shared a little of my story with her, not everything, just enough so that she understood why I lingered there, why I asked about the cost of this or that, and why I examined each item with care. Margaret became a small light in those days. She would set aside things she thought I might need: a kettle in good condition, a blanket with only the faintest of frays, a set of plates that didn't match but felt cheerful all the same. She never asked too many questions, and I was grateful for that. At home, I moved with the same quiet purpose. I stopped offering what was no longer wanted. I let them handle their meals, their chores, their plans. I focused on how I could control my garden, my room, and my small preparations. I think they noticed the change, in their own way. My son would glance at me sometimes, as if he meant to ask something but thought better of it. My daughter seemed relieved, as though my withdrawal made things easier for her. And my grandson, while he was young, his world was full of his own growing life, and I did not wish to burden him. I still found comfort in my garden. The roses bloomed as if to cheer me on, the herbs thrived under my care, the small patch of lavender swayed in the breeze. I spoke to the garden in my mind, telling it of my plans, my hopes, my fears. It listened, in the way only a garden can, offering its quiet companionship. One afternoon, I took the bus to a small village a few miles away. I had seen a notice at the library, an advertisement for a room to let, modest and clean, in a house owned by a widow who lived alone. I wanted to see it for myself, to imagine what it might feel like to have a space of my own again. The room was small, with a view of the hills, a simple bed, a chair by the window, a place to set a kettle. It was enough, more than enough. The woman who owned the house, Mrs. Aldrich, was kind. She showed me the room without fuss, spoke gently, and asked no prying questions. There was a warmth in the house that I had not felt in a long time, a sense of peace, of shared understanding. I told her I would think about it, and she nodded as if she knew I would be back. I returned home that evening feeling lighter than I had in years. I sat in my chair by the window, watching the garden fade into twilight, and I let myself imagine what it would be like. A place where I could make tea in the morning without feeling in the way. A place where I could sit with a book, plant a few flowers, and hear my own voice without wondering if it was unwelcome. I moved differently after that visit. Each day felt like a step closer to reclaiming something I had lost, not just a place to live, but a sense of myself that had been buried beneath years of sacrifice and silence. I began to say small goodbyes in my heart, to the house, to the garden, to the spaces where I had tried so hard to belong. The final pieces of my plan came together slowly. I spoke with Margaret about collecting a few essential things I could leave with her until I was ready. I wrote down important numbers, kept them in my pocket, and practiced the route I would take. Each detail, no matter how small, felt like a stitch in the fabric of my new beginning, and through it all, I remained quiet. I did not announce my intentions, did not seek permission or approval. I moved through the house as I always had, tending to what was mine, letting go of what no longer was. There was a peace in that, a strength I had not known I possessed. In the quiet hours of the night, I would sit by my window, looking out at the garden bathed in moonlight, and I would whisper to my husband. I would tell him of my plans, of my hopes, of the small courage I had found. And in those moments, I felt him near, as if he were guiding me, urging me on. I moved differently after that, not because I wanted revenge or to prove anything to anyone, but because I wanted, at last, to choose myself. And in choosing myself, I found a kind of freedom I had not dared to dream of. The morning I left, I did so as I had lived those last few months, quietly, without fuss, without ceremony. The house was still, bathed in that soft gray light that comes just before dawn. I stood for a moment in the doorway of my small room, looking back at the space that had been mine. It was bare now, save for the scent of lavender that lingered in the air, and the small indentations where my chair had rested near the window. I stepped out, my bag light in my hand, my heart heavier than I had expected. I closed the door behind me with care, as though not to disturb the silence I was leaving behind. The garden greeted me in that gentle way. It always had the roses still closed in sleep, the herbs heavy with dew. I paused at the gate, touched the worn wood with my fingertips, and breathed in the morning air one last time. Then I walked away. The room I had chosen in the small village was simple, but it was mine. Mrs. Aldrich greeted me with tea and quiet understanding, and I settled into my new life with the kind of relief that feels like an exhale you didn't know you were holding. The days began to take on a soft, steady rhythm. I rose early, tended to the small pots of herbs I placed on the windowsill, walked to the market for bread and fruit, read in the afternoons by the window that looked out over the hills. But even as I began to build something new, I wondered what the house I had left behind felt like without me. I had not gone to punish them, though part of me hoped my absence would be felt, would matter. I had left because it was time. Still, I could not help but wonder. At first, I imagine, they did not notice. Breakfast was made, the house tidied, the routines carried on. Perhaps they thought I had gone for a walk or into town. But as the hours passed, I knew the truth must have begun to settle in. The empty room, the missing suitcase, the absence of my quiet presence. There are things, I suppose, that they began to lose without me. The small, unseen things I had done each day to keep their world turning smoothly. The plants watered, the clothes mended, the small messes tidied before they even noticed them. The quiet watching over, the listening ear, the steady hand ready to help without being asked. Without me, I imagined, the garden began to change. The weeds crept in at the edges, the roses grew unruly, the herbs went to seed. It would have been no one's fault, not truly. Just that no one else saw it the way I did, cared for it in the small, daily ways that kept it flourishing. I imagined the house felt different too, quieter in a way that wasn't peaceful. A kind of emptiness that settled into the corners, the spaces where I used to be. The meals perhaps felt a little less warm, the rooms a little less welcoming, and I wondered about my grandson. If he noticed first, if he asked where I had gone, if he missed the sound of my voice reading to him, the way I smoothed his hair back from his forehead when he was tired or worried. I hoped he understood, in his own young way, that I had left, not because I didn't love him, but because I had to love myself at last. Days turned into weeks. I kept to my quiet life, but sometimes I would pass by places where I imagined seeing them on market days, in the park, along the high street. I never did. But I thought of them. I thought of what they might be feeling, if they regretted, if they missed me, if they saw now what they had lost. It wasn't the revenge I wanted, it was recognition, a simple seeing of all I had been, all I had done, all I had given. There were small signs that they felt my absence. A letter arrived, written in my son's careful hand, short, polite, filled with questions that circled around the one he did not ask. Why did you leave? I read it twice, folded it carefully, and set it aside. I wasn't ready to answer. Not yet. I heard, too, through kind neighbors, through Margaret at the charity shop, that the house seemed quieter, more strained, that my grandson had asked after me, that the garden had grown wild, that my daughter-in-law seemed tired, my son more distracted than usual. I took no joy in hearing it, but I felt a strange sorrowful comfort in knowing that my absence had left a shape behind, that I had mattered. After all, in my small room, I began to write again. Letters I did not send, pages filled with thoughts I had held inside for too long. I wrote to my husband, to my younger self, even to my son. I wrote of my days, my memories, my hopes. The act of writing became a kind of healing, a way to stitch myself back together. I built small friendships in the village. Margaret became a trusted companion, as did Mrs. Aldridge. We would sit together sometimes in the evenings, sharing tea, speaking of ordinary things. And slowly, I began to feel less alone. And yet, I still thought of them, not with bitterness, not with anger, but with a quiet ache that I carried with me. I wondered if they understood what they had lost, not just the tasks I had done, but the love behind them, the quiet watching over, the presence that had filled the house with a kind of invisible warmth. What they lost without me was not something grand or loud. It was the small, steady light that had kept the shadows at bay, the gentle hands that had held their world together in ways they had not seen. And now, with that light gone, perhaps they saw, at last, what it had meant. I did not wish them harm. I wished them clarity. One wished them the chance to see, really see, and perhaps, in time, to understand. And I, in my small room with my herbs on the windowsill and my letters folded neatly in a box, began to see myself again. Not as what I had lost, but as what I still was. And that, I think, was the beginning of something new. It was a quiet Sunday morning, the kind where the world feels hushed and gentle, as if even the wind has agreed to pause. I sat at my small table by the window, the hills soft and blue in the distance, the air carrying the faint scent of wildflowers. My tea had grown cold beside me, forgotten as I watched the clouds drift, slow and unhurried. And in that stillness, I felt something stir inside me, need to set down what had long gone unsaid, to give shape to the words I had carried like stones in my chest. I took out the box where I kept my letters, those folded confessions I had written in the weeks since I left, pages filled with memories, with sorrow, with hope. I had written to my husband, to the girl I had once been, to the boy I had raised, to the woman I had become. I had written in the quiet hours when sleep would not come, when the night pressed close around me and the weight of my choices felt both heavy and right. But this morning felt different. The words inside me were not meant to stay hidden in that box. They were ready, at last, to be given breath, to be released into the world, not for answers, not for forgiveness, but because they needed to be said. I reached for a fresh sheet of paper, smoothed it flat with hands that trembled slightly, and began. "My dear boy," I wrote, the pen pausing after those words, as if even now I wasn't sure I had the right to call him that anymore. But I left them there. They were true, and I would not take them back. I have thought long and hard about what I might say to you, should I ever find the courage. And now, here I am, writing in the hope that these words might reach you not with anger, but with the love that has never left me, not even in the hardest moments. The words came slowly at first, like a stream just breaking free of winter's ice. Then they gathered strength, flowing steady and sure. I left not to hurt you, though I know my absence must have caused confusion, perhaps even pain. I left because I could no longer stay where I was unseen, where my presence had become a burden instead of a blessing. I left because I had to find, at last, the pieces of myself that I had given away bit by bit over the years, hoping it would be enough to be loved. I have spent so much of my life in the background, doing the small, unseen things that kept our family whole. I did them gladly, with love, with pride, but over time, it felt as though I became invisible in that giving, as though the love behind the gestures was forgotten, taken as a given, or worse, unnoticed entirely. I heard your words that day about the house, about the plans made without me. I understood them more than you might think. I see now that you are trying to do what you believed was best, to ease your own worries, to secure your family's future. But in doing so, you crossed a line that left me with no choice. You took from me the last thing I could truly call my own, and with that, I saw clearly that my place there was no longer mine to claim. I paused, the pen hovering over the page, my eyes stinging with unshed tears. Outside, the world carried on, birds flitting from tree to tree, the soft bleating of sheep in the distance. I let their gentle sounds steady me, then continued. I want you to know that I do not hate you. I could never hate you. You are my son, and I will love you until my last breath. But love, I have learned, cannot ask a person to disappear for its sake. I disappeared for too long, and I have only now begun to find my way back. I write this, not to make you feel guilt or shame. That is not my wish. I write so you might understand what you could not see while I stood quietly beside you. I was there, always there, in the small moments that went unnoticed. And now, I am here, building something new with what is left of me, that I hope that one day, when the noise of life softens, you will look back and see me clearly. I hope you will remember not just the things I did, but the reasons I did them. The love that wove through every meal I cooked, every sock I mended, every bedtime story I read to your boy. I hope you will see that my leaving was not an act of anger, but of mercy, both for you and for myself. The letter filled several pages by the time I set down the pen. My hand ached, my heart felt both heavy and light, as if I had set down a great weight. I folded the pages carefully, slipped them into an envelope, and addressed it in my careful, steady hand. I placed it beside my tea and sat in the quiet, watching as the sun climbed higher in the sky. I did not send it that day. I kept it near, reading it over in the days that followed, letting its truths settle deeper into me. I knew I would send it when the time was right, when I no longer needed the words for myself, but could give them freely. And in the act of writing, something shifted. I felt a loosening of the sorrow I had carried, a softening of the sharp edges of my grief. The letter had changed me, not because it would change him, but because it had given voice to what I had held inside for too long. In the evenings, I would sit by the window, the letter resting on the table beside me, and I would feel a kind of peace I had not known in years. I watched the sky darken, the first stars appear, and I whispered a quiet thank you to the night for holding my secrets, for bearing witness to my small, steady return to myself, and as the days passed, I found I could breathe a little easier. I could move through the world with a lighter step. I had said what needed to be said, if only on paper. I had faced the truths I had long avoided, and in doing so, I had freed myself, at last, from the silence that had bound me. The letter that changed me remained on my table for some time, a reminder of both what was lost and what was found. And when the day came that I sealed it, stamped it, and placed it in the post, I did so with a heart that was, if not whole, at least healing, and that, I had come to understand, was enough. The days now pass gently, like the slow drift of clouds across a wide sky. My life has become quiet, not in a lonely way, but in the way of something that has finally settled where it belongs. The little room I call home suits me. The walls are lined with soft, worn books. A small radio hums low in the evenings, offering company when the night grows long. My herbs flourish on the windowsill, their scent filling the air with reminders of the garden I left behind. I still wake early, as I always have. The first light spills across the hills, casting the world in gold, and I sit with my tea, watching the dawn. It is in these moments, before the village stirs, that I feel most at peace. The world is quiet, and so am I. The rush, the worry, the endless giving that once filled my days have fallen away. What remains is simple: a breath, a cup of tea, the soft birdsong outside my window. I walk often now, down to the market, where the vendors have come to know me, where Margaret greets me with a smile, where Mrs. Aldrich and I sometimes sit on a bench to share news of our small world. I walk along the narrow lanes that wind through the village, past stone walls draped with ivy, past gardens that bloom in wild abandon. The air smells of earth and growing things, and I breathe it in deeply, as if I can fill the hollow spaces inside me with the life that surrounds me. Sometimes, when I pass the post office, I wonder about the letter I sent. I imagine my son holding it in his hands, reading the words I labored over, feeling, perhaps, the weight of them. I do not know if he understood, if it softened his heart, if it opened his eyes, but that no longer troubles me the way it once might have. I said what I needed to say, the rest is his to carry, or not. The quiet I have now is not the silence I once endured. It is not the hush of being overlooked, of being pushed aside, of being forgotten. It is the quiet of contentment, of having let go of what no longer served me. It is the quiet of knowing who I am, even if no one else sees it. In this quiet, I have found small joys: a book well read, and read again; the feel of soil beneath my fingers as I tend the pots on my windowsill; the soft click of knitting needles in the afternoon light; the simple pleasure of baking bread, the warmth of it filling my small kitchen. These things ask nothing of me but presence, and in return, they give me peace. There are moments, of course, when sorrow visits. A memory will surface of the sound of my grandson's laughter, the way my son's hand felt in mine when he was small, the familiar creak of the floorboards in that house I left behind. These memories come unbidden, and when they do, I let them stay a while. I do not push them away. They are part of me, threads woven through the fabric of my life. But they no longer ache as they once did. They remind me of what was, and of how far I have come. I have learned, in this quiet, to be gentle with myself, to forgive the years I spent trying to be enough for others at the cost of myself, to forgive the girl I was, who believed that love meant sacrifice without end, to forgive the woman who stayed too long, who gave too much, who lost herself in the giving. I have found that peace does not come all at once. It comes in small moments: a breath of fresh air, the warmth of the sun on your face, the kindness of a stranger, the taste of tea after a long walk. It comes when you stop chasing it and let it find you where you are. Mrs. Aldrich and I have become friends in the way of women who have lived long enough to know the value of shared silences. We sit together sometimes, in the garden behind her house, and watch the world go by. We speak of simple things: the weather, the flowers, the news of the village. There is no need for more. My son wrote once more after my letter. A shorter note. This time, it spoke of concern, of questions left unasked, of hopes that we might talk in time. I read it, folded it carefully, and set it with the first. I do not know if I will answer. Perhaps one day. For now, I am content to let the quiet speak for me. I have come to see that what they lost without me was not just the tasks I performed or the presents I offered. It was the love that filled those things, the care that shaped them, the steady, unseen light that kept the shadows from growing too long. And what I lost, for a time, was myself. But here, in this small room with its view of the hills, I have found myself again, not as I was, but as I am now. Older, perhaps a little worn at the edges, but whole in a way I had not been in years. My life is quiet now. There is no great excitement, no grand adventure. But there is peace. There is the simple joy of choosing how I spend my days, of tending to what is mine, of being answerable to no one but myself. I walk each day. I read, I write, I tend my small garden, I breathe, and that, I have come to understand, is enough. I wasn't angry. I was finally empty, and that was beautiful.